The Power of Faith, a story that will change your life. Chapter 1, The Drought's Dawn. Thomas Miller stood in his parched cornfield, dust swirling around his worn boots like tiny tornadoes. The morning sun cast long shadows across acres of withered stalks, painting a grim picture of what should have been a thriving farm. His calloused hands, rough from years of working the land, brushed against the brittle corn leaves that crackled at the slightest touch. His daughter Sarah, just 7 years old, with untamed brown curls and determined green eyes, clutched her favorite stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hopeful, and watched her father from the edge of the field. The rabbit, missing an ear and patched in several places, had been her constant companion since her mother's passing 2 years ago. She wore her mother's old gardening bandana, far too big for her small head, but she insisted on wearing it every day. "Daddy, will the corn get better?" she asked, her voice small against the vast silence of the dying field. A warm breeze rustled through the withered stalks, carrying with it the scent of sun-baked earth and fading hopes. Thomas turned to look at his daughter, his heart heavy with the weight of uncertainty. The lines around his eyes deepened as he knelt to her level, dust settling on his faded jeans. At 35, recent years had aged him beyond his years, each failed harvest adding another wrinkle to his weathered face. "I don't know, sweetheart," he replied honestly, adjusting her bandana with gentle hands. "This drought's the worst in 40 years. Even the deep well is running low." He forced a smile, but Sarah's perceptive eyes caught the worry behind it. From the wraparound porch of the old farmhouse, Grandfather James watched the scene unfold. At 72, he'd seen his share of hard times, but something about this drought felt different. His son's defeated posture troubled him deeply. The Miller farm had been in their family for 4 generations, each one facing their own trials, but never had he seen the land so parched, so lifeless. The old man's fingers traced the worn wooden railing, smoothed by decades of worried hands. The morning glory vines that usually climbed the porch posts hung limp and brown, their dried tendrils a stark reminder of better days. His late wife Martha had planted those vines, saying they welcomed each new day with hope. Now they stood as silent witnesses to the farm's struggle. Sarah skipped over to her grandfather, Mr. Hopeful, bouncing along beside her. "Grandpa, tell me about the time when the corn grew taller than the house," she requested, her natural optimism a bright spot in the somber morning. James lifted her onto the porch railing, secure in his steady grip. "Well, that was the summer your grandmother invented her special way of talking to the plants," he began, catching Thomas's eye across the yard. His son paused his worried field inspection to listen, perhaps needing the reminder of better times as much as Sarah did. A distant rumble of thunder teased the horizon, but James knew better than to hope. These days, clouds passed by without sharing their precious cargo, leaving only disappointment in their wake. Yet as he held his granddaughter, listening to her giggle at his story, he felt something stir in his heart. A familiar feeling he hadn't experienced since Martha's days on the farm. Thomas made his way back to the porch, each step heavy with the burden of responsibility. The mortgage papers waited on his desk inside, their demands as relentless as the drought. But for now, he leaned against the railing beside his daughter, letting her innocent faith wash over him like the rain they so desperately needed. The morning stretched on, the sun climbing higher in the cloudless sky. The 3 generations of Millers remained on the porch, bound together by love, hope, and the unspoken prayer for rain that seemed to hover in the air around them. Chapter 2, A Child's Faith. The evening settled over the Miller farm like a heavy blanket, bringing little relief from the day's heat. In his cramped office, Thomas sat surrounded by papers illuminated by a single desk lamp, its warm glow creating shadows that danced across columns of increasingly worrying numbers. The ancient desk, passed down through generations of Millers, creaked under the weight of unpaid bills and bank notices. The calculator's soft clicking provided a somber rhythm to his calculations. Each number felt like another stone added to the burden he carried. The farm's savings account, once robust, had dwindled to almost nothing. Even the emergency fund, set aside for Sarah's education, might need to be touched, a thought that made his stomach churn. Sarah's voice drifted through the thin walls, clear and unwavering in her nightly ritual. She knelt beside her bed, wearing her mother's old nightgown that had been lovingly altered by Grandfather James. Mr. Hopeful sat propped against her pillow, his remaining ear tilted as if listening to her prayers. "Dear God," she began, her voice carrying the pure conviction only a child could muster. "Thank you for Daddy and Grandpa and Mr. Hopeful. And thank you especially for the rain that's coming tomorrow. I know the corn is very thirsty, but you never forget to water your garden. That's what Mommy used to say." Thomas's pen stopped moving. The mention of her mother, Rachel, sent a familiar ache through his heart. Rachel had possessed that same unshakable faith, even during her illness. He remembered her final spring, still planting flowers from her wheelchair, still believing in tomorrow. "Sarah, honey," he called out gently, pushing back from his desk. He stood in her doorway, taking in the sight of her small form silhouetted against her window. "I checked the weather report again. There's no rain in the forecast for at least 2 weeks. Sarah turned to him, her green eyes, so like her mother's, shining with absolute certainty. "But I believe, Daddy. Mommy always said faith is like planting a seed. You can't see what's growing underground, but you know it's there." Grandfather James appeared in the hallway, his footsteps almost silent on the old floorboards. He carried a steaming mug of chamomile tea, Rachel's favorite blend, which he still grew in his small herb garden. Something in Sarah's words had brought a misty look to his eyes. "She's right about that," he said softly, handing the tea to Thomas. "Your mother used to say faith grows deepest in the dark, just like roots." Sarah bounced up from her knees, grabbed Mr. Hopeful, and climbed into her bed. The quilt she snuggled under was another of Rachel's legacies, each patch telling a story of their family's history. "Grandpa, tell me again about how Mommy used to dance in the rain." James settled into the old rocking chair by her bed, its gentle creaking a familiar comfort. Well, she believed every raindrop was a gift worth celebrating. Even during the dry spell of 95, she'd say, "The rain always returns to those who welcome it with faith." Thomas leaned against the doorframe, sipping the tea that tasted of memories. Outside, the evening stars emerged in a cloudless sky. But for a moment, he could almost feel Rachel there, her unwavering faith filling the room like a gentle breeze. Sarah's voice pulled him back to the present. "Don't worry, Daddy. I asked God very specifically for rain tomorrow. And Mommy always said God loves specific prayers because it shows you're really paying attention." Grandfather James caught Thomas's eye, a knowing look passing between them. They'd both learned long ago not to underestimate the power of a Miller woman's faith. "Faith like yours could move mountains, little one," James said, tucking the quilt around her. "I don't need to move mountains, Grandpa," Sarah yawned, clutching Mr. Hopeful close. "Just rain clouds." As Sarah drifted off to sleep, Thomas and his father stood in the hallway, their shadows long in the dim light. The weight of the farm's future pressed heavy on both their shoulders, but something about Sarah's certainty made it feel a little lighter. "She has Rachel's spirit," James observed quietly, his weathered hand resting on Thomas's shoulder. "And Rachel's gift for making me believe in impossible things," Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion. In the distance, a whip-poor-will called into the night, its song a lonely echo across the parched fields. But in Sarah's room, under a quilt made of memories and love, faith bloomed like flowers after rain. Chapter 3: Seeds of Doubt. The morning brought no rain, just another relentlessly clear sky. Mr. Peterson's sleek black car kicked up dust as it wound its way down the farm's long driveway, the gleaming vehicle looking out of place among the weathered buildings and withered fields. The bank manager's arrival, unannounced and early, sent a ripple of tension through the Miller household. Thomas watched from the kitchen window, his coffee growing cold in his hands. His father sat at the old oak table, carefully stringing beans from his small garden, one of the few places still showing signs of life, thanks to careful rationing of well water. "He's early this month," Grandfather James observed quietly, his weathered hands never pausing in their work. The beans made a soft clicking sound as they fell into the metal bowl, a rhythm that usually brought comfort, but today felt like a countdown. Sarah sat cross-legged on the porch, conducting what she called her morning garden service. She'd gathered her stuffed animals as an audience while she read Bible stories to her newly planted hope seeds. Her clear voice carried through the screen door, reciting from her children's Bible with careful precision. Mr. Peterson emerged from his car, his city shoes already dusty. Despite the heat, he wore a full suit, though he'd long since given up on the tie for these rural visits. His face, usually carefully neutral, carried in gravity that made Thomas's heart sink. "Thomas," the bank manager nodded as he climbed the porch steps. He paused, noting Sarah's little congregation. "Good morning, Miss Sarah." Sarah looked up, beaming. "Hello, Mr. Peterson. Would you like to join our garden service? We're learning about Noah and the flood." There was no irony in her voice, just pure invitation. Something flickered across the banker's face. Discomfort, perhaps, or pity. "Thank you, but I need to speak with your father about some grown-up matters." Inside the kitchen, Mr. Peterson laid out papers on the table, careful to avoid the beans. Grandfather James made no move to leave, his presence both a support and a reminder of the generations of history at stake. "I'll be straight with you, Thomas," Mr. Peterson began, his voice carrying the weight of decisions already made. "Without significant rainfall this week, the bank will have to begin foreclosure proceedings. The numbers," he gestured at the papers, "they just don't add up anymore." Sarah's voice drifted in from outside, still reading her Bible story. "And the rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. But it's going to rain." Sarah had appeared in the doorway. Mr. Hopeful clutched tight against her chest. "I prayed for it. God promised Noah he'd always take care of his people." The look Mr. Peterson gave her was filled with such pity that Thomas had to turn away. He knew that look, had seen it at Rachel's funeral when Sarah told everyone her mommy was just planting flowers in heaven. "Sarah, honey," Thomas started, but she was already moving to the table, her small finger pointing at the papers with surprising authority. "You don't need these," she said firmly. "The rain is coming. I planted hope seeds yesterday, and Grandpa says hope seeds never fail." James looked up from his beans, something fierce and proud in his eyes. "She's right about the hope seeds. My Martha planted them every year, drought or no." Mr. Peterson shuffled his papers uncomfortably. "Hope seeds won't satisfy the bank's requirements, Mr. Miller. We need real solutions." Later that afternoon, Thomas found Sarah in the garden behind the house, carefully patting soil around something small and green. The tender care in her movements reminded him so much of Rachel that his throat tightened. "What's that, sweetie?" "More hope seeds," she replied seriously, her hands dirty, but her purpose clean. "Grandpa gave them to me from Mommy's special box. He says they're magic when you believe." Thomas knelt beside her, the rich smell of the soil bringing back memories of better years. The small sprouts she'd planted yesterday were already showing signs of life. Tiny green promises pushing through the earth despite the drought. "Sarah," he began gently, "sometimes things don't work out the way we pray for them to." She looked at him with Rachel's eyes, wise beyond their years. "Mommy said that too. But she said it doesn't mean God isn't listening. Sometimes he just has a different answer." From his spot on the porch, Grandfather James watched them work together in the small garden. He held Martha's old seed box in his lap, its contents nearly depleted now. The marigold seeds he'd given Sarah weren't magic, of course, but he remembered what Martha used to say: "Faith grows best in the soil of impossibility." The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, but in that small garden patch, something was growing that defied the drought. Not just flowers, but the kind of faith that blooms in the desert of doubt. Chapter 4: The Community's Test. Word spread through the farming community like wildfire in dry grass. At first, it was whispered over fences and shared during chance meetings at the general store. The Miller girl believed rain was coming. Some scoffed, others listened with desperate hope, but no one could remain indifferent to Sarah's unwavering faith. The Rodriguez family's farm bordered the Millers' land to the east. Maria Rodriguez watched her withering tomato plants with a heavy heart, while her son Miguel, Sarah's best friend from school, kicked at the dusty ground. The drought had hit their farm just as hard, their irrigation pond now barely a muddy puddle. "Mama," Miguel said, pulling at her sleeve, "Sarah says God promised to send rain." "She never lies, Mama." Maria looked across the fence line where Sarah's marigolds somehow thrived in their small patch. The sight stirred something in her heart. a memory of her own grandmother in Mexico who could make flowers bloom in the desert and never lost faith in tomorrow. "Perhaps," she said slowly, adjusting her sun hat, "we should visit the Millers." They found Sarah conducting another garden service, this time with a larger audience. The Johnson twins from the dairy farm sat cross-legged beside her, their usual mischief subdued. Old Mr. Thompson, who hadn't left his property since his wife's passing last spring, stood at the garden's edge, his weathered hat held respectfully in his hands. "In my dream," Sarah was saying, Mr. Hopeful propped up beside her Bible, the rain danced on the corn leaves like it was singing. "God told me it's coming to wash away all the dust and make everything new again." "But when?" little Amy Johnson asked, her voice small but hungry for hope. "Soon," Sarah replied with absolute certainty. "The hope seeds are already growing, see?" She pointed to the row of marigold sprouts, their green leaves defiant against the brown landscape. Maria stepped forward, something ancient and familiar stirring in her soul. "My abuela," she said, her accent thickening with memory. "She always said faith is like water in the desert. You can't see it, but it keeps the cactus blooming." Thomas watched from the porch, conflicted emotions playing across his face. Grandfather James sat in his rocker, stringing more beans, but his eyes never left the growing gathering in the garden. "What do you make of this, Dad?" Thomas asked quietly. "I make that hope is spreading faster than doubt," James replied, his gnarled fingers moving steadily. "And that's no small miracle in times like these." By late afternoon, Maria had an idea. "Perhaps," she suggested to Thomas, "we should all pray together. My church in Mexico would hold prayer circles in times of drought. What do we have to lose?" The suggestion took root. That evening, families began arriving at the Miller's barn. They brought folding chairs and covered dishes, thermoses of coffee, and well-worn Bibles. The Johnsons brought their twins and their famous lemonade. The Thompsons arrived with ancient hymnals. Even the skeptical Andersons showed up, though they claimed it was just to be neighborly. The old barn, its boards weathered by countless seasons, had hosted many gatherings over the years. Barn dances, harvest celebrations, community meetings. But tonight felt different. The usual social barriers melted away under the weight of shared need and desperate hope. Sarah sat on a hay bale at the front, Mr. Hopeful in her lap, seemingly unfazed by the crowd. Her small voice carried clearly as she led them in prayer, mixing Bible verses with innocent observations about God's love for gardens and farmers. "Dear God," she began, "thank you for bringing everyone together to wait for your rain. Thank you for Mommy's hope seeds that are growing even though it's dry. And thank you especially for showing everyone that miracles are real." Maria led the group in Spanish prayers, their ancient rhythms blending with English whispers. Mr. Thompson's deep bass rumbled through old hymns about God's faithfulness. The Johnson twins sat unusually still, their small hands clasped tightly together. As the evening progressed, something shifted in the atmosphere of the barn. It wasn't just about rain anymore. It was about community, about shared faith, about finding hope in the most unlikely garden. Grandfather James watched it all from his corner, Martha's seed box open in his lap. He carefully began distributing the remaining seeds, marigolds, zinnias, and Rachel's favorite morning glories. "Plant them with faith," he told each person, his voice carrying the weight of generations. Martha always said, "A garden planted in hope always blooms, no matter the weather." As families left that evening, something new had taken root, not in the parched earth, but in hearts that had been as dry as the land. They carried home more than just seeds. They carried a child's contagious faith and a reminder of their shared strength. Thomas stood in the barn doorway long after everyone had gone, watching the stars emerge in the still cloudless sky. Sarah's voice drifted out from the house where she was saying her nightly prayers. "See, God," she was saying, "I told you everyone needed hope seeds. Now we're all waiting together." And somehow, in the quiet of that drought-stricken evening, waiting together felt a lot like rain. Chapter 5, Lessons in Faith. The weekend arrived with the same relentless sun, but something had changed in the atmosphere of the Miller farm. Grandfather James had opened his workshop early that morning, laying out old photo albums and memory boxes that hadn't seen daylight in years. The sweet scent of wood shavings mixed with the musty perfume of aged paper as Sarah sat beside him, carefully turning pages of family history. "Look here," James said, pointing to a faded photograph of a young woman with Sarah's eyes and determined smile. "That's your grandmother Martha during the drought of '72, the worst we'd seen until now." Sarah traced her grandmother's face with a gentle finger. The photo showed Martha standing in a garden bursting with colors despite the dusty backdrop. "She looks like Mommy," Sarah observed quietly. "That's where your mother learned her garden magic," James smiled, his weathered hands selecting another photo. Martha believed every seed was a promise, every sprout a miracle. Even during that terrible drought, she kept planting. The workshop, normally James's private sanctuary, had become a classroom of faith. Its walls were lined with tools passed down through generations, each telling its own story of perseverance. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows, creating halos around the floating wood dust. "But how did she stay strong, Grandpa?" Sarah asked, clutching Mr. Hopeful close as she studied a picture of withered fields behind the blooming garden. James pulled out an old leather journal, its pages soft with age. She wrote down every miracle, no matter how small. "Look here. Today, a single sunflower bloomed in the dust. God's reminder that beauty can survive anywhere." Thomas appeared in the workshop doorway, drawn by the voices. He'd been avoiding these memories, these tangible pieces of the past, but something in Sarah's absorbed expression made him step inside. "Your grandmother used to say faith isn't about knowing how the story ends," James continued, acknowledging his son's presence with a knowing look. "It's about believing in the story itself." He opened Martha's old garden box, revealing packets of seeds preserved through decades. Each was carefully labeled in her flowing handwriting. "Hope seeds, plant with prayer," and "faith flowers for dark times." "She kept these for times like now," James explained, selecting a packet. "Said they were specially blessed because they grew in the worst drought, proving God's faithfulness." Sarah handled the packets with reverence. "Is that why you gave me some for my garden?" "Partly," James smiled, "but mostly because I see her in you. That same unfailing belief that tomorrow holds miracles." Throughout the day, more neighbors dropped by the workshop, drawn by word of the old photos and stories. Maria Rodriguez examined a picture of Martha teaching young Rachel about gardening, her eyes misty with recognition. "Mi abuela had the same way," she shared, pulling out her own worn photo from her purse. "See? Her garden in the desert, blooming impossible colors. She called it El Jardín de la Fe, the Garden of Faith." The children gathered around as the adults shared stories of past droughts and surprising recoveries. Miguel translated his mother's tales of desert blooms and unexpected rains. The Johnson twins listened wide-eyed to Mr. Thompson's account of the sudden storm of '82 that came after weeks of prayer. In a corner of the workshop, Thomas found himself drawn to his mother's journal. Her words jumped off the page. "Faith grows best in impossible soil. That's why God sometimes leads us into desert places, to show us what can bloom when we have nothing left but trust." The afternoon light slanted golden through the windows as Sarah organized the hope seed packets, carefully setting aside ones to share with each family. She worked with the serious concentration of someone who understood the weight of her task. "Daddy," she called out, making Thomas look up from the journal. "Grandma wrote something here about you. She said you were her best gardening student because you believed in the seeds even before they sprouted." Thomas felt something shift in his heart, a memory of younger days when faith came as naturally as breathing. He watched his daughter distributing seeds of hope with the same certainty his mother had once shown, and for a moment, the generations seemed to overlap like pages in a well-loved book. Outside, the dry wind rustled through withered corn, but in the workshop, stories of faith and perseverance bloomed like Martha's impossible gardens. Each shared memory, each faded photograph, each carefully preserved seed packet served as a reminder that drought seasons don't last forever, but faith, properly tended, could weather any storm. Chapter 6: The Storm Inside. As the week progressed without a single cloud in sight, tension grew as thick as the dust that coated everything on the farm. The hope seeds had sprouted in gardens across the community, tiny green witnesses to shared faith, but Mr. Peterson's daily calls became increasingly urgent. The bank's patience, like the soil, was bone dry. Thomas stood in his office, phone pressed to his ear, listening to another grim update. Through the window, he could see Sarah tending her garden, her small figure bowed in concentration, as she carefully watered each plant with her tiny share of the rationed well water. "The board meets tomorrow, Thomas." Mr. Peterson's voice crackled through the line. "Without significant change in conditions, they'll vote to begin proceedings. I've delayed as long as I can." A few neighbors had stopped visiting, their initial surge of hope giving way to embarrassment at their momentary belief in a child's prayers. Old Mr. Thompson's words at the general store that morning still stung. "Faith's fine for Sunday school, but it won't save our farms." Sarah's garden, however, continued to flourish inexplicably. The marigolds blazed like tiny suns against the dusty landscape, their vitality almost shocking against the withered backdrop. People drove by slowly, some pointing, others shaking their heads at the impossible display. Maria Rodriguez still visited daily, bringing Miguel and her own freshly planted hope seeds. "Es un milagro pequeño," she would say, touching the bright blooms gently. "A small miracle, but miracles grow." But that evening, as Thomas watched another cloudless sunset paint the sky in mockingly beautiful colors, something inside him finally broke. The weight of responsibility, of generations of Miller family history, of his daughter's unwavering faith, it all became too much. He found Sarah in her usual spot, singing softly to her flowers as she checked each one before bedtime. Mr. Hopeful sat propped against a watering can, supervising as always. "Sarah," he began, his voice rougher than he intended, "we need to talk about being realistic." She looked up, soil smudged on her cheek, her mother's bandana keeping her curls from her eyes. "Is this about Mr. Peterson's phone calls?" "Partly." Thomas knelt beside her, ignoring the protest of his tired knees. Sometimes prayers aren't answered the way we want. Sometimes farms fail and families have to move, and that doesn't mean God doesn't love us. It just means..." "But Daddy," she interrupted, turning to her marigolds with the certainty of a child who still saw miracles everywhere. "They're always answered somehow. Look, my hope seeds are growing without rain. Nobody else's flowers are growing, but these are. Isn't that a miracle already?" The simple logic of her faith hit him like a physical blow. He looked at the thriving plants, so vibrant against the dying landscape, and felt tears threatening. Later that night, he found his father in the kitchen, a cup of Martha's chamomile tea cooling before him. The old man was reading Rachel's Bible, its pages worn soft with years of searching hands. "How do I protect her from disappointment without breaking her spirit?" Thomas asked, slumping into a chair. "The bank meets tomorrow. We're out of time, out of options, out of everything except her faith." Grandfather James closed the Bible carefully, his weathered fingers lingering on its cover. "Did I ever tell you about the year your mother almost lost her garden?" Thomas looked up, surprised. "Mom's garden never failed." "That's what everyone remembers now," James nodded. "But there was one summer, must have been 75 or 76, when everything died except one stubborn marigold. Martha spent hours talking to that flower, sharing her heart with it like Sarah does now. Said as long as one thing bloomed, hope wasn't lost." He paused, taking a sip of tea. The rain came 3 days later. Not enough to save everything, but enough to start again. Martha always said that flower kept her faith alive until the rain found its way back. Outside, the night wind whispered through the cornstalks, a dry sound like prayer beads sliding through faithful fingers. In the garden, Sarah's marigolds glowed softly in the moonlight, sentinels of hope in a landscape of doubt. "Maybe," Grandfather James said softly, "she's not the one who needs protecting. Maybe, son, she's protecting your spirit instead." Thomas stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark shapes of the farm that had been his family's heart for generations. Somewhere in the distance, a whip-poor-will called, its song a lonely question in the night. But beneath that sound, he could hear Sarah's voice through her bedroom wall. Still praying, still believing, still holding on to faith as naturally as breathing. The storm inside him raged on, but in the midst of it, a small voice that sounded surprisingly like his mother's whispered, "Faith grows best in impossible soil." Chapter 7, Faith's Storm. The morning of the bank board meeting dawned clear and hot, like every day before it. But something felt different in the air, a heaviness that had nothing to do with the weather. Thomas dressed in his best shirt, the one Rachel had given him for their last anniversary, his fingers trembling slightly as he fastened the buttons. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, solemnly arranging her marigolds in a jar. "For the bank people," she explained, carefully positioning each bloom, "so they can see what hope looks like." The flowers seemed to glow from within, their orange and yellow petals almost too bright for the somber morning. Grandfather James watched from his chair, Martha's old Bible open on his lap, his weathered finger marking a passage about faith moving mountains. As Thomas prepared to leave, the community began to arrive. First came Maria and Miguel Rodriguez, carrying their own hope seed blooms. Then the Johnson family, the twins clutching hand-drawn pictures of rain clouds. Mr. Thompson arrived with his ancient truck backfiring in the drive, and more followed. A steady stream of neighbors, each bringing something: flowers, food, prayers written on paper. "We're coming with you," Maria announced, her accent thick with emotion. "All of us, to show the bank what community faith looks like." Sarah beamed, gathering her flowers. "See, Daddy? God's already working miracles. He brought everyone together." The caravan of trucks and cars that followed Thomas into town kicked up a dust cloud visible for miles. At the bank, Mr. Peterson met them at the door, his eyes widening at the sight of nearly 30 people filing in behind Thomas, led by a small girl carrying impossibly vibrant marigolds. Inside the boardroom, suited executives shifted uncomfortably as Sarah carefully placed her flowers in the center of their polished table. The air conditioning hummed, a sterile contrast to the living faith that had just walked through their door. "Before you vote," Thomas began, his voice steadier than he felt, "I want you to see something." He pulled out his phone, showing pictures of the community prayer meetings, the gardens of hope seeds sprouting across farms, the children learning about faith from their elders. Sarah's clear voice cut through the corporate silence. "God doesn't just send rain from the sky," she announced with the conviction of ages. "Sometimes he sends it through people who believe together." Suddenly, Miguel shouted from his position by the window, "Look!" Everyone turned. In the distance, dark clouds were building, real clouds, heavy with promise. A wind had picked up, carrying the forgotten scent of rain. The board members moved to the windows as the first drops began to fall. Sarah pressed her face to the glass, her breath fogging it as she whispered, "Thank you, God." Thunder rolled across the sky like heaven's applause. Outside, people were emerging from buildings, faces turned upward in disbelief and joy. The rain fell harder, drawing curtains of silver across the drought-stricken town. "Well," said the bank president, watching as his expensive car was soaked by the downpour, "I believe this changes our discussion considerably." But most of the room had emptied. The farming families ran outside, letting the rain soak them completely. Sarah danced in puddles already forming on the sidewalk, her laughter mixing with the storm's music. Maria lifted her face to the sky, tears mixing with raindrops as she whispered prayers of thanksgiving in Spanish. Thomas stood in the doorway of the bank, watching his daughter splash and twirl. Grandfather James appeared beside him, Martha's Bible protected under his jacket. "Martha always said," James spoke softly, "that the greatest storms come right after the deepest faith is tested." The rain fell for hours, soaking deep into the parched earth. The farmers knew it wouldn't solve everything immediately. The drought's damage would take time to heal. But as they gathered in the miller's barn that evening, soaked and happy, sharing hot coffee and fresh hope, they understood that the real miracle wasn't just the rain. Sarah sat in her usual spot on the hay bale, Mr. Hopeful slightly damp but still dignified in her lap. "See?" she said to anyone who would listen. "God always answers prayers. Sometimes he just wants us all to pray together first." The barn's old boards creaked in the wind, and through gaps in the ceiling, they could see stars beginning to peek through breaking clouds. The rain continued its gentle rhythm on the roof, nature's own hymn of faithfulness. Thomas watched his daughter lead another prayer of thanksgiving, her small voice carrying the weight of generations of faith. In his pocket, he could feel the bank's new proposal. Terms reworked, time extended, hope restored. But he knew the real treasury wasn't in those papers. It was in the hearts gathered here, in the faith that had bloomed like marigolds in the desert of doubt. Outside, the first night rain in months painted the world clean. And somewhere, surely, Rachel and Martha were smiling at the garden of faith their little girl had grown. Chapter 8: The Garden of Faith. 1 year later, the Miller farm bloomed like never before. The autumn sun painted the cornfields gold, stalks standing tall against a sky that had remembered how to rain. But the most remarkable changes weren't in the fields. They were in the hearts of those who had learned to believe. Sarah's garden had expanded beyond its original borders, now occupying a special place in the center of the farm. The original marigolds still bloomed there, surrounded by new growth, morning glories that Rachel had loved, Martha's favorite zinnias, and contributions from every family in the community. Each plant told a story of faith rewarded. "It's become quite a testimony," Grandfather James remarked one morning, sitting in his rocker on the porch. His workshop had been transformed into a seed library, where families could come to share both seeds and stories. The walls were lined with photographs: Sarah's magical marigolds during the drought, the day of the saving rain, and countless moments of community fellowship that followed. Thomas stood at the porch railing, watching Sarah conduct her now famous garden tours. Every weekend, people came from neighboring towns to hear the story of the hope seeds and the little girl who never stopped believing. Today's group included families facing their own droughts, some financial, some spiritual, all searching for hope. "And this is where we held our first garden service," Sarah explained. Mr. Hopeful perched in the crook of her arm, his remaining ear slightly more worn, but his place in the story secure. "Grandpa says holy ground isn't just in churches. It's anywhere people come together to believe in miracles." Maria Rodriguez, who had become the garden's co-caretaker, added her own testimony in flowing Spanglish, describing how faith had bloomed across language barriers and cultural differences. Her own garden now supplied fresh vegetables to the community market they'd started, where produce was often accompanied by stories of God's faithfulness. The Johnson twins, no longer quite so mischievous, had started a children's garden club. Every Wednesday afternoon, young voices filled the air as they learned to plant both seeds and faith. Their mother swore they'd never shown such patience for anything before. Mr. Thompson, transformed by that season of drought, had turned his dairy farm into a place of healing. People came to sit in his garden, share their burdens, and remember how hope had bloomed in the driest time. He'd become known as the community's wisdom keeper, sharing stories of past trials overcome through faith and unity. Even Mr. Peterson had changed. The bank now kept a pot of marigolds in its lobby, hope seeds, the plaque read, from the garden that faith grew. He'd learned to look beyond numbers on paper to see the real wealth in community and belief. As the afternoon light turned golden, the farm hosted its monthly community dinner. Tables groaned under the weight of covered dishes, each recipe carrying its own history. The Rodriguez family's tamales sat next to Mrs. Johnson's apple pie. Mr. Thompson's fresh cheese complemented Maria's salsa, a feast of unity that had grown from seeds of faith. Grandfather James stood to say grace, his voice strong despite his years. "Lord," he began, "we thank you not just for the harvest in our fields, but for the harvest of faith you've grown in our hearts." Thomas watched as Sarah slipped her small hand into his. She was a little taller now, but her faith remained childlike in its purity. The bandana she wore, Rachel's old one, had become a symbol recognized throughout the community. People said wearing it while planting guaranteed a miracle, but Sarah knew better. "It's not the bandana that makes things grow," she'd explain. "It's remembering that Mommy never stopped believing, even when she couldn't garden anymore. She just planted her faith in people instead of flowers." As the sun set behind the cornfields, casting long shadows across the garden of faith, the community gathered for their evening tradition. They shared stories of the drought, not with bitterness now, but with gratitude for the lessons learned. Children played among the flowers, absorbing faith as naturally as plants absorbed sunlight. Thomas found his father at the edge of the garden, both men watching Sarah teach Miguel's little sister how to plant hope seeds. "You know," James said softly, "Martha and Rachel are seeing this, all of it. The garden they started blooming bigger than they could have imagined." Through the faith of a child, Thomas nodded, understanding now what his mother had written in her journal. Faith grows best in impossible soil. The evening ended as it always did now, with prayer and song rising from the garden, a chorus of voices unified by remembered hardship and present joy. Sarah's clear voice led them in her favorite hymn, the one about faith moving mountains. And in the gentle evening breeze, the marigolds swayed like tiny dancers, still glowing with the same miraculous light that had first bloomed in the depth of drought. They remained as a testament to anyone who visited. Hope planted in faith always flowers, and the greatest miracles grow not from the sky above, but from the believing heart below. Remember, Sarah would tell each visitor, Mr. Hopeful nodding sagely beside her, every garden needs 3 things: seeds, water, and faith. And the greatest of these is faith. The Miller farm had become more than a place. It was a living parable of faith's power to transform not just land, but lives. And in every seed planted, every flower that bloomed, the story continued to grow, teaching future generations that the most powerful seeds are those planted in the soil of unwavering belief.